So I'm going to start off with this quote from Maya Angelou. You can see right here in my cursor. I love this quote because I think it summarizes this idea of perception so perfectly. I've learned that people will forget what you said, people will forget what you did, but people will never forget how you made them feel. And that's really, at its core, such a great summary of what perception is all about. It's about how you take in your reality and your communication interactions in here in your head. And so now let's move into understanding the perception process. So what is perception? Let's define it. Let's understand the process. So the first thing that we typically observe is called here in red our first order realities. These are things that are physically observable, things that we can touch and feel and taste and smell and hear. These are things that are accessible to us using our senses. So for example, I can touch and feel my phone, I can hold it, I can hear it when someone calls me. It is part of my first order reality. I can see that my case is black, I can see that my phone is 5 inches wide. Those are all physically observable things about my phone that I can describe. However, once we take in that first order reality, once we start understanding what data we're working with, what information from the world we're working with, we have to assign meaning to it. And that's where second order realities come in. Second order realities is that stage of the perception process where we assign meaning to the things that we observed from first order realities. So for example, you might observe the first order reality of a puppy being small and fluffy and brown, having big eyes. And so in your head, you're taking in all of that data, that first order reality of looking at that puppy for objectively what it is. And in your head, you assign it the value of being cute. Right? So that's a second order reality when we start giving meaning to the stuff that we are observing with our eyes, our ears, our nose, what we're tasting, what we're hearing. Second order realities, therefore, don't reside in objects or events, but in our minds, right? We assign the idea of cute to puppies, but puppies themselves don't walk around going, I'm cute, and there's nothing scientific or biologically necessary for a puppy to be cute. That's just an assignment that we give to puppies. We don't think snakes are cute, right? And so in our minds, we assign certain values to certain things that we observe in reality. So in the perception process, what is actually happening once we assign meaning? Because I know that we just went from first order reality to second order reality. How do we even make that jump? And so what we're going to do now is we're going to break down the perception process into smaller steps so that you can kind of follow along with how does my mind go from seeing puppy to processing it as cute. So the first thing is selection. We select or we decide what we're going to pay attention to. In our world, there are so many things that are happening around us all the time. It is nearly impossible to try to pay attention to every single thing in this world. If you tried to pay crucial attention to every single thing you interacted with on a regular basis, your brain would just explode, right? It doesn't have that capacity to take in and absorb every single thing that you're observing. So in that first process, we're selecting what we're going to pay attention to. And this is key because that means that if we select to pay attention to certain things, we're not paying attention to other things. And so by choosing to pay attention to certain things, we're naturally kind of omitting or forgetting about the other things that exist in reality, but we're just not paying attention to them. If we don't pay attention to them, we don't consider them real or present in our minds. And that's very key in perception. So what helps us decide what do I pay attention to, what do I not pay attention to? The first thing is intensity. We really like things that have a lot of intensity to them, things that are very loud, something that is very large, something that is out of the ordinary, that is super intense and in our face, we tend to pay attention to. So for example, if you're driving and you're just enjoying your time driving, but you hear a police car siren driving by you, the intensity of that really loud sound is going to make you stop, even just for a second, to pay attention to that sound. So you may have been paying attention to someone in the car who was talking or music or whatever, but for that split second, you're now choosing to pay attention to this cop car driving by because that's a more intense sound for you, or an intense first order reality that you're paying attention to now. Repetition, we also like things that are in patterns. We like to pay attention to things that are visually repetitious, so that come in patterns. They're very pleasing to us. And lastly, contrast. We like things that stand out, both in color and in size. So one example I can give you is the McDonald's arch. So if you picture the McDonald's arch in your head right now, it's yellow, right? The it's yellow, and then it's behind typically a red background. This is done on purpose because that helps contrast, those two bright colors contrast one another and catch your attention. So when you're driving by a McDonald's or on the freeway and you see a McDonald's sign, it's something that will visually catch your attention because not all buildings are yellow and red, and that definitely makes McDonald's stand out to you. Maybe makes you crave McDonald's. You'll also notice that In-N-Out sometimes does that with their signs as well, makes these very bright red, bright yellow colors. Okay, so once we've selected what we want to pay attention to, then we have to organize it. So we are taking in all of this data using our senses. Now our brain has to do something with it. And what our brain does is it puts what we're observing in the world into schema or patterns or boxes that are helpful for us to understand what we just took in. And this is very important to the meaning-making process because the box or the schema that we choose to put that information into dictates how we feel about the information and ultimately how we react to the information. So these are called, as we know, constructs. And constructs is just a very fancy word for schema or pattern. I like to use the metaphor of a box, right? You organize things by putting them in different boxes. So it's quite similar in that process. And we have 4 major types of constructs that we're going to cover in this chapter to help us understand a little bit further about what's going on in here. How am I organizing the data that I'm getting from from my external world on a regular basis? The first is physical constructs. This classifies people according to their appearance. Studies have found, for example, that people who are more physically attractive are actually seen as also more credible, smart-worthy, intelligent, and capable. While being physically beautiful has nothing to do with your intelligence or your ability, in our heads, we classify those as similar constructs. If you are physically attractive, we also put you in the box or the construct of being intelligent. We associate that with being credible or trustworthy. And so that is what physical constructs help us do. They also help us classify what we consider to be dangerous or not dangerous. So, for example, if you see an animal, if you're hiking in the forest and you see an animal, but you're not quite sure what kind of animal it is, but you definitely know that you saw a large animal with really sharp teeth, those physical constructs help you know, ooh, large animal with big teeth means danger, means I need to get out of here as soon as possible. If you saw a tiny animal that was the size of a squirrel, you probably wouldn't react the same way. So those physical constructs, the way something looks or the way a person looks, dictates how we react to that situation based off the schema that we, or the box that we put that information into, how we organize it and assign meaning to it. Secondly is role constructs. These rely on social positions in order to classify people. For example, in our society, we very much value people that are lawyers or doctors or have any type of higher education degree of that point. We also treat people who are elderly or who are teachers or who are police officers, parents, children differently based off the role that we perceive them to have. So some people, for example, might treat an elderly person differently because they see them as having a different role. in society. And role constructs are very important because they not only dictate your behavior, but they also are consequences of your past experiences. So, for example, some students were sharing in their journals about how they find that in their family, different genders in their family have to perform different functions. That's an example of a role construct as well. If you are from a culture or a family culture where, for example, a woman is always expected to do housework or cook or clean, that's an example of a role construct. The role of a woman is to do this. So if you pair that with a physical construct, you can physically see a woman and then assume her role off of it. Third, interaction constructs focus on social behavior. So we have rules in society on what is acceptable or not acceptable behavior in a given situation. And so when we're observing different types of behavior, we put them in different constructs that we have in our head, different boxes to assign meaning to them, whether we like that behavior or don't like that behavior, where we find it appropriate or not appropriate. Lastly, psychological constructs refer to your internal state of mind and your disposition. This is how you organize information based off of how you are feeling in this moment, your current disposition, your mood, your psychological state of mind, your mental health, all of that affects how you're going to assign meaning to the various types of stimuli or data or first order world realities that you are getting in. So, perception, however, is always up for debate. So if you've ever been in an argument where someone says, no, I think the fight started with this, and you're like, no, I think the fight started because of this, what is happening there is because you are both punctuating the event or the conflict in different ways. So, what punctuation is all about is in our heads, we decide when the start and the end of something is, when what the cause of something is, and what the effect of it was. So, if you're fighting with your romantic partner, for example, and you say, well, I think the fight really started when this morning at breakfast you kind of snapped at me and were really rude to me. But to them, the fight may have started or been caused by even earlier in the day when you woke up and maybe took too long to use the bathroom and they got irritated because of that. So people will punctuate or cite the cause and effect of varying situations based off of their perception. Okay? How do we communicate about this, or how do we find a way when we are punctuating things differently to find some common ground? We do that through a tactic called negotiation. This is the process in which communicators influence each other's perceptions through communication. The best way to explain this is how we exchange stories or narratives. So we sit down and we tell each other, hey, this is how I see it and this is how I see what happened. And then you listen to how the other person saw or perceived something. And then that helps you to be able to negotiate the different ways you may be punctuating things. Okay. So with all of that in mind and that perception process in mind, one of the things we have to recognize, similar to what we did in chapter 1 when we discuss the communication model, is that there will always be external issues that will affect our perception. So as much as we want to try to have a holistic view of our world and of other people, that may not always be possible given the fact that there are lots of noise or other sources of distraction that hinder us from truly having a more clear perception of our world or a certain situation or person. And I've listed them here, and the book has also listed them for you. I've broken them up into physiological and psychological. So physiological here in the pink, referring to body-related issues, and psychological referring to mind-related issues. So let's deal with the physiological first. So physiological influences come from our external environment, and they involve our bodies and the cycles that our bodies go through, right? We're human beings. We definitely have our ups and downs health-wise. And we also have varying senses and abilities that will affect the way we take in the world, the way we perceive the world. So that's why, number one, the senses. The senses will always affect the way that we perceive the world. If you are someone who wears glasses or doesn't have as good of eyesight, that will definitely affect the way you are perceiving the world versus someone who has better eyesight or 20/20 eyesight. Age will also affect it, not just because of the experience, the fact that you grow with more experiences, but also because your age will dictate the way you look at certain events in the world, certain people, certain situations and experiences, because physiologically you're feeling different, right? Um, Third, health and fatigue. So this is related to, but not definitely dependent on age. You could be older and completely healthy and younger and not that healthy. So health and fatigue is very important. For example, if you didn't get a very good night's sleep, you didn't eat breakfast, and you haven't really been engaging in a lot of self-care where you take care of your body and you make sure to stay healthy, you may find it really hard to pay attention in class or even pay attention to this lecture right now, because your body right now might feel really tired or not nourished enough, and your mind, therefore, as a result, might not be totally focused on perceiving and understanding and taking in this lecture to the fullest extent that you could. And so remember that health and fatigue will always be factors in those situations. Biological cycles, both men and women have them, and they go through them in a cyclical nature. So your biological cycle really affects your hormones, and that's kind of why we care about this, because your hormones will affect how you perceive the world, both men and women. So it's not just a women thing. And so depending on the levels of your hormones, you may feel more positive or more negative one day. It definitely does affect your mindset, so therefore your perception and the way you take in your first order realities will also be affected as well. Hunger, as I mentioned with health and fatigue, is related as well, so never try to pay attention to anything when you're hungry. I'm sure you all know this. I definitely have learned this. Nothing matters when you're hungry except food. Sometimes it's even hard just to be engaged in a conversation with someone that you care about if you're hungry. All you want is food. And neurobehavioral challenges. I know that seems related to psychological influences, but we put neurobehavioral challenges here because neurobehavioral, meaning issues that are going on with your neurons in your brain, the way your brain is built and set up, is physiological. So some people, for example, are born with neurobehavioral challenges that affect their brain and therefore affect their perception. And that's typically part of their genetic predisposition or a multitude of other biological reasons. I'm not a biology teacher, so I won't speak to that. But depending on the type of neurobehavioral challenges you experience, that's definitely going to influence your perception. Lastly, psychological influences, your mood, your emotional state. This is tied directly to those physiological changes up there. So definitely how you treat your body will always affect your mood and your mind because they're one and the same. But for example, you might eat healthy, exercise well, be in complete health, sleep well, and still be in a bad mood for other reasons as well. So your emotional state will always dictate the way you take in information. Secondly, your self-concept, ding, ding, ding. That was from our last chapter on this self-concept. Very important that you grasp that concept there, because our self-concept will constantly dictate how we take in the world, how we see it, and what we choose to do with that information, how we organize it, and how we respond to other people. Okay. So, this is a slide that I have to help push you to think about how social media changes our perception. This video right here is about catfishing. I encourage you to watch it on your own time and think about these 3 questions that I have here as further application to help you understand how our perception is affected in our modern day world. Another theory that we're going to cover in this chapter is called standpoint theory. And this relates to perception because standpoint theory argues that a person's position in a society affects or shapes his or her view of society in general and of specific individuals. One example I have of this is a very close friend of mine is a police officer. Has been a police officer for quite some time. And it's so interesting when he and I have interactions or we talk about the world, because me being a teacher, I have a much more positive outlook on the world because I get to be surrounded by all of you, my wonderful students, every semester. I get to meet new students, I get to learn from new students, and I get to interact with you in a positive and welcoming atmosphere. My friend, however, that is a police officer, obviously does not experience the same type of atmosphere when he goes to work. His job by nature is very dangerous, and is definitely an environment that is not always welcoming or joyful or wonderful. And so because of that, he and I always tease each other because I'm definitely the more positive person, where when I perceive things happening in the world, I'm a glass half full kind of gal. I always try to see it from a more positive mindset. Whereas because of the nature of his work, understandably, he's a little bit more suspicious of people. His perception is skewed where he very much is more defensive, and I don't mean defensive in attitude. I mean defensive of, he worries more about safety. He worries more about day-to-day things that I usually would not perceive or take into account in my perception. And he definitely has a more glass half empty type of perspective because of his standpoint in society, where he stands in society. So standpoint theory is fascinating because it helps us understand how the environment that we're surrounded with, the roles that we take on, all of that, how that ends up affecting our perception. And I definitely see it in our conversations as well. We also have social influences on our perception. As I alluded to earlier, and some of you have already talked about in your journals, sex and gender roles play a huge part in our everyday communication interactions, based off what not only your biological sex is, but your gender presentation as well. You will experience different expectations out of you. You will be perceived in different ways, and you yourself will also perceive others in different ways. This is a quick recap from chapter 2, so I won't go too deep into it. Gender refers to the social or psychological dimensions of masculine and feminine behavior. AKA, remember in chapter 2 when I talked about how being a certain gender, a woman or a man, female or masculine, are just performances, right, of what we as a society have decided, well, this is what is feminine, this is what is masculine. Our occupational role, as standpoint theory says, the work that we do governs our view of the world, and relational roles, being a daughter, being a son, being a cousin, being an aunt, being a mom, being a dad, all of that, all those different roles that where you have responsibility towards other people definitely affects who we think we are and our perception as well. Case in point, of course, for any of you that are parents or want to become parents, I'm sure your perception and the way you perceived the world changed drastically the moment you became a parent or even found out you were becoming a parent. So, what are common issues that happen in perception? Because in a perfect world, we would be able to, as our communication model in chapter 1 states, to be able to receive, send, and assign meaning as accurately as possible. And we know that that's not true. We all get into interpersonal conflicts because we perceive things differently than someone else, and that can cause real serious relational tension and conflict. Why does that happen? That happens because of these errors in perception that we engage in, which I'm going to cover right now. So, the first thing we tend to do in perception is attribution. We attach meaning to behavior. And sometimes we attach the wrong type of meaning to behavior. And these inaccurate attributions can lead to very detrimental building of constructs that do not reflect reality. Remember that your constructs are your boxes, right, where you organize information. Those are built off of your past experiences. So if you were already taking in things perceptually incorrectly, you're building constructs that are not reflective of reality. For example, stereotypes is one example. Stereotypes is when we categorize others on the basis of easily recognizable but not necessarily significant characteristics. And then what we do is that we assume all those characteristics on the rest of the group. Okay, so one example would be, let's say that you are coming to Chafee, you parked in the parking lot, out of nowhere, I come out and I mug you and I take your backpack and I run away, right? Um, and after that, you assume that every single small Asian woman you see is going to be out to mug you. That would be an inaccurate attribution because, yes, while it is easily recognizable and obvious that I am a short, tiny Asian woman, that those characteristics had nothing to do significantly with the fact that I mugged you. The fact that I mugged you just means I'm a terrible person, right? I shouldn't be mugging you. But that doesn't mean that all small Asian women in the world will be mugging you. And so what that does is that we then in our heads assign that characteristic to all groups. Maybe after that, you're like super suspicious of small Asian people all the time, especially small Asian women, and you always think they're going to mug you. That is an engagement of a stereotype where you see it in one instance and you presume that it's going to happen in all instances, when we don't know that in reality, but yet we do that a lot perceptually in our heads when we are categorizing information, people, and events. Okay? We also cling to first impressions. We love initial impressions, and those are the ones that carry more weight. If you've ever had anyone coach you for a job interview and they say the first impression is the most important, they are definitely right. That first time that we meet someone is really vivid in our heads, and we cling to those impressions very quickly. This is because of something called the primacy effect, which is that tendency that we have to pay the most attention to something that happens first. If you've ever been to a concert, you might not remember the whole concert, but you might remember actually the first opening song that the artist opened with. You might remember the beginning of a movie, but not really so much the middle of the movie, right? We have this tendency to recall much better things that happen first in a sequence rather than anything else that follows. We also engage in what is called the halo effect. This is when we try to form an overall positive impression of a person that sticks. Okay, so we meet them, we really like them because we think that they're really physically attractive. So even afterwards, when they're being rude to us or we hear bad things about them, when we engage in the halo effect, we're like, oh, but I really liked this person. Like, they're so cute, or they're so awesome, or they're so friendly. So we find one thing about them that we really like, and we cling to that first impression, that first positive thing that we like about them, and ignore later signs of negative qualities about them or things we don't like about them instead. Third, confirmation bias. This is when we seek out and organize our impressions to support our initial opinion. So let's say ahead of time you feel that you're going to meet someone and you already have heard not very good things about them. And so as a result, when you meet them, you are seeking out information to confirm these already initial opinions that you have. And so this is, if this sounds familiar, it's very similar to the self-fulfilling prophecy that we discussed in chapter 3. But this more specifically deals with our perception and wanting to verify or validate our initial opinion when we're perceiving things. And remember when I talked about how the perception process involves both selecting what we pay attention to and then assigning meaning to it. Sometimes we might select to pay attention to just the good or just the bad things about someone or about a certain situation just in order to support what we originally thought about the situation or about the person. Okay. We also tend to judge ourselves and people that are like us more charitably than we do others. We are our own worst critic, but at the same time, we also have the most capability to be empathetic with just ourselves. And that empathy extends to people who are us and like us. This is broken up into two perceptual errors. First is the fundamental attribution error. This is your tendency to give more weight to personal qualities than to the situation when making attributions about others' behaviors. So let's say you get into a conflict with someone and you raised your voice at them and you definitely were very rude with them. But in your head, you decide that the fight happened because, oh, it's just because they're just a really aggressive or dramatic person. It's their problem, not mine. And you don't recognize that the situation also involves you, right? Whether you're right or wrong in the conflict, if you raised your voice at them or also participated in the conflict in a negative way, you contributed to a negative situation as well. But what happens is in our heads, we engage in fundamental attribution error, where we tend to blame the person rather than the situation that they're also in. Okay? Self-serving bias, this essentially refers to the idea that we will always try to put ourselves in the best light that we can. When we perform poorly, we blame external forces. So when we're not doing good, we blame other things. And when we are doing good, we address it on ourselves. So one example is when young children, for example, who are just learning how to play sports, so soccer, for example, it is found that when they win, children are more likely to say, I won, I won. And they will communicate with their parents, I won. And they'll take that I in a positive way to indicate that they contributed to the winning. However, when their team loses, children tend to say, we lost. And then they also add on the varying ways that they wish their teammates had contributed better. So in that situation, when they don't win, they're blaming external forces or other things outside of their control in order to validate the reasons for why they did not win the game. But when they did win the game, they want to take full credit as individuals that, hey, I'm a major reason for why we won this game. Very, very interesting. We're also influenced by our expectations. I'm sure all of us have had really high or really low expectations of an event or a situation or a person. And that definitely affects your perception, because when you walk into a situation expecting a lot or little, that's going to affect what you select. Step one, what you select to perceive, right? What you choose to perceive or not to perceive as a result, which I mentioned earlier in lecture. This information is crucial because it influences our decision making. It dictates what we're going to do in a given situation or how we will treat other people. We are also, in the pink right here, influenced by the obvious, meaning that we tend to look at what is most obvious or visible or evident in a situation, and we ignore all other possibilities for why something happened or how something happened. One example is I was hanging with a group of friends of mine. We were having lunch in Los Angeles, and Los Angeles, for those of you who have been or do not know, has a very large homeless population. And one homeless individual came up to me and asked me for a meal, which I purchased for him. And afterwards he had left, thanked me and left. And one of my friends told me, you shouldn't buy them meals, because all you're doing is just giving them free stuff. They're not working for anything. And she pointed out that it was, in the afternoon. He obviously isn't working if he's just walking around asking for food in the afternoon. And I thought that that was such an interesting comment, because it was very reflective of her perception, where she was in that situation influenced by the obvious. She looked at the most obvious thing, which was that he was homeless, that he was asking for food in the middle of the day. So she's taking all those factors into account, but she's also not recognizing the other factors that play into that situation. What caused him to be homeless? What is causing him to continue to be homeless, right? What are the situational and systemic factors that are feeding into our very serious problem of homelessness? So what we tend to do when we're influenced by the obvious is we point to the thing that is most obvious or most present, and we blame that one factor or that one thing. And we don't recognize that there are multitudes of different other reasons for why something happens, and that there can be more than one cause and effect to something. A similar problem, for example, might be our opioid addiction that we're having here in the United States. Multitudes of people who are not familiar with the issue tend to, in their perception, be influenced by the obvious. They think, well, if you are, addicted to drugs, for example, that seems to be your problem, and you can just not be addicted anymore. You can choose to go to get help or to wean yourself off of drugs. to think that way about drug addiction is reflective of a perception that is influenced by the obvious. We all know, for those of you who do not know or do not have that experience, it's not quite that simple and easy to help an addict not become an addict overnight. It's not something that happens overnight. And we also have to take into, just like we did with the homeless individual, varying factors in that situation. What caused them to become a drug addict? What type of drug are they taking? How long have they been an addict? What type of treatment would make most sense for them? If they relapse, why are they relapsing? All of that has to be taken into account when we're perceiving the situation and deciding what to do about it. And so always make sure that you don't let yourself just be influenced by the obvious. Don't make your decisions based off of what you're perceiving in this moment right now, but rather always try to take into account the very many situational and external factors that can cause a person or a situation to act or be a certain way. Lastly, we also assume others are like us. A lot of students have asked me if this is similar to ethnocentrism, and it's not. It's a related cousin, but it's not. Ethnocentrism, as we talked about in chapter 2, is the strong belief that your culture, your way of doing things is better. Assuming others are like us doesn't mean that you think your culture is better, but that sometimes unconsciously we walk into situations already assuming that people are going to be just like us, that think like us, speak the same language as us. And so because of that, it affects our perception of other people because we automatically assume they have the same views or experiences as us, which is definitely not true, especially here in California, where we are definitely more diverse than other parts of the country. We definitely can't assume that others are like us or that their viewpoints are like us. And that obviously, once you do find out that someone thinks differently than you, that may be a very serious shock to you because you already walked into the situation assuming that they're going to think or be or act just like you. And we do this rather unconsciously, but it's very important to practice that self-monitoring technique that we talked about in chapter 1 and keep ourselves in check as well. All right. So, why do we care about all this? You know that I always like to, in lecture, not only give you the definitions and define stuff, but to also talk about why does it matter for us in the realm of communication. And the reason it matters for us is that mismatched perceptions or incorrect perceptions seriously impact communication. But, spoiler alert, mismatched perceptions will always happen. They will always happen because no two people can always have the same exact perceptions of an event, right? We're all different people. As we learned in chapter 1 with our communication model, we all have different environments. Channels always affect communication, and how we send, receive, and assign meaning varies from person to person and situation to situation. So there will always be times when your perception does not match up with other people, even people that you are close to, like your family members or your friends. Your perception will not always match up exactly like them. But the good news is that in this chapter we learn of the varying tools to try to negotiate our perceptions with one another and achieve synchronized or similar perceptions. So the first step of the first skill that I think is super important and that we're going to consistently refer to over and over and over again in our chapter on conflict, in our chapter on listening, we are going to refer to perception checking here that you see in orange. It is a fantastic way to review your assumptions, to make sure that you're not engaging in all of those errors that we just discussed in the last slide, and share your own interpretation to make sure that the other person is also aware of the perceptions that you are holding, and therefore your communication can proceed in a more productive and effective light because now you have more contextual understanding of one another's perception of the event or the situation or of each other. So there are 3 parts to perception checking. The first is describe the behavior you noticed. So what about the behavior did you see? And keyword here is describe. Please notate that for both your exam purposes and assignment purposes. When we perception check, the first step is not to try to assign meaning to anything, but to purely just describe what we saw. So instead of saying something like, hey, you didn't say hi to me today and that was really rude and I could tell you were ignoring me. That's assigning meaning to something. In step 1, you purely describe what you say. You say, hey, I waved to you in the hallway today, but you didn't turn around. And that's it, right? You just describe what you saw. I waved to you and you didn't turn around. You don't assign meaning to it. You don't say that it was rude or that that person was ignoring you or anything like that. In the second step, you consider 2 interpretations for the behavior. And the reason for the 2 is so that the other person has a chance to correct you or respond. And so that you are communicating, you are open to different interpretations. So you describe what you saw. And then in the second one, you say, hey, since I waved to you, but you didn't turn around and see me, it made me really feel like you were angry with me. One possible interpretation. Or that you were ignoring me. And so step 2 is when you assign meaning, but you do so by framing it as an interpretation. You do so by telling the other person, hey, this is what I saw and this is what I think it meant. And then in the third step, you invite them, you request clarification. Hey, is this what you meant to do? Did you really mean to ignore me? Are you really upset with me? Or was it an accident? And so you invite the other person to help you check your perception. And they might say, yeah, I was really upset with you. And so that's why I didn't, say hi to you. Or they might say something like, whoa, I didn't even see you in the hallway. I'm so sorry that I ignored you. I'm sorry you felt that way, but that was not my intention. And so perception checking is beautiful because it helps us ask the other person what they intended with their behavior and with their communication. So we're not left here trying to dissect it in our heads and thinking of multiple different reasons, like, why did they do that? Perception checking helps us just tackle straight on and ask the source, why did you do that? Or what did you mean by saying this or doing this? And it's a beautiful thing to be able to do that with someone. And of course, this is not possible without building empathy. I'm not going to dive too deep into it because we definitely spent a lot of time in chapters 1 and 2 and 3 on empathy, but I want to bring empathy in again, and so does your textbook, in trying to make sure that you engage in empathetic listening and thinking when you are perception checking. Remember that empathy is not the same as sympathy. Empathy is when you recreate or you step into the other person's experience. You step into their shoes and you try to understand where they are coming from. Sympathy is more like, hey, I feel bad for you. We're not looking for sympathy here. We're looking for empathy. Okay? Lastly, remember that when we build empathy, the most important thing is to be open-minded. I put a piece of interesting study here. There's a link between empathy and ethical altruism. Altruism also meaning doing good for people, just to do good. Bystanders who feel empathy are more likely to intervene. We find that people who are more empathetic or practice empathy on a regular basis are more likely to engage in altruistic or kind acts for other people. Okay? So with that being said, that was chapter 4. It's an awesome chapter to read and see of the varying steps that we use to perceive and take in our world. And it's, like I said, a great tie-in to chapters 2 and 3. So to sum up and recap what we learned today in chapter 4. Chapter 4 was all focused on our perception, so the way we take in the world. We saw a lot of threads of chapters 2 and 3 in this process when we discussed the 2 different types of realities that we face, first order and second order realities. We discussed how we are the ones that assign meanings to the things that we see, and so therefore that meaning exists and resides inside of our heads. We learned that our perception and how we assign meaning to things affects our communication and our behavior, and ultimately, therefore, our relationships. We learned about the steps of the perception process. The first one is to select. The second one is to organize using the constructs that we talked about, or the boxes, to organize the information. We learned about what stereotypes are and how perception plays into them. And finally, we also learned about how to perception check and the ways that empathy can be involved in that. Once again, perception checking is 3 steps: describing the behavior you saw, providing 2 possible interpretations of it, and then offering to the other person, please correct me or tell me if my perception is wrong or incorrect. So that was chapter 4. I hope that this was helpful for you in clarifying a lot of these perceptual steps that we learned. I'm going to go ahead and take questions right now. I seem like I already have one. Geraldine has asked, do our influences and upbringings contribute to our self-fulfilling prophecies, confirmation biases, and stereotypes? Definitely. So it's actually a mixture of all three. When we grow up in a certain culture, from chapter 2, as we learned, and develop a sense of self and identity, as we learned in chapter 3, that definitely seriously affects how we engage in confirmation bias and stereotype. Studies have found, for example, that people who are more, who interact more with others that are different from them are less likely to exhibit biased, bigoted, racist, sexist, or stereotypical behavior. What that means is if you know someone from a population that is different from you are less likely to be biased against that population. 60% of America of Americans, 60% of Americans, for example, have reported that they've never talked to one-on-one a person who is Muslim. So, of course, for those Americans who have not had the opportunity to engage with a Muslim person one-on-one, they will definitely engage in stereotypes and have a different construct or organizational pattern, as we talked about, for Muslim people, because the only information on Muslim people that they'll get is from the media or from third person choices or social media. They won't ever have that one-on-one interaction that will help them build additional constructs and avoid stereotyping people. So it was a great question, Geraldine. Sydney Taylor has asked, what is the major difference between first and second order realities? Perfect question. First order realities, like I said, are, let me go back to them so you can see them, are the physically observable things. So these are things that we can all agree on. So you guys can all agree that this is an iPhone. You can agree that the back of my iPhone is black. You can agree that it's 5 inches long and how many inches wide. You can agree that it's a phone, that it's solid, right? You can agree about all those physical qualities of the object. So that's a first order reality. It's not until our second order realities that we start to assign meaning to them. Let me get to that in a second. So second order reality, Sydney, is when we start assigning meaning to it. And that is why second order realities don't exist, like I said earlier, in the object. It exists in the mind. So we objectively can agree that this is black, right? This is the color black, that this is an iPhone. But in your head, you might see iPhone and then think, oh, iPhones suck. The fact that you think iPhones suck is an issue that is in your mind, not necessarily anything to do with the object itself. And so second order realities are different from first order realities because first order realities are physically observable, whereas second order realities is how we feel about the object or the person or the situation. And that's all here in our heads. So we can all agree about first order realities. Like I said, we can all agree that this is a black iPhone, but we might differ in our second order reality or the meaning that we attach to iPhone. Some of us might attach a positive meaning to iPhone. Some of us might attach negative meaning to iPhone. So that is the second order reality, and that's the major difference between the two. I hope that answers your question, Sydney. So far I've only had 2 questions from Geraldine and Sydney. I'm waiting on Brianna, Daniela, and Juan for their questions. Remember that you do have to ask a question to receive full credit for your attendance. So I'll wait like maybe 1 more minute, and if I don't get a question, I'm going to go ahead and close out lecture for today. Brianna. Okay, cool. Brianna has asked, is the halo effect similar to being stubborn, since the individual will not be able to see why a person can be bad for them relationship-wise? Yes, definitely. So, being stubborn, let me get to my halo effect slide before I even talk about this, so I can kind of reference it. Oops, sorry. I know I'm making you all dizzy right now. So, Brianna's asked a great question. She asked if the halo effect is similar to being stubborn, since the individual will not be able to see why a person can be bad for them. And she asked this in the context of relationships. And I would say that if someone is stubborn, that might be a personality trait that they already have that feeds into their constructs and the way they perceive the world. And I think that's a great application, Brianna. You might, for example, meet someone and think that they're wonderful and awesome, and all your friends are like, why are you dating this person? Why are you with this person? Because our friends or our family members might see other aspects of that person that we are choosing not to select. Remember that there's 2 steps of the perception process. We have to select what we pay attention to and then organize or assign meaning to what we're paying attention to. So in the halo effect, we are attaching ourselves in a very stubborn way. So it's a great application, Brianna. We are attaching ourselves to the one positive thing about that person that we like, and therefore that closes us off to perceiving any other of the negative traits that they have. And of course, all human beings have both positive and negative traits, and so we are definitely not getting a full a complete perception of someone if we are closing ourselves off to only looking at that one positive characteristic about them that we initially liked. And that can be really difficult. And I understand that, and I've experienced that. It's definitely hard to convince someone to see the other aspects of another human being that you see. Sometimes people, when they get into relationships, want to cling onto that initial lovey-dovey puppy love aspect of the relationship, and they choose to not pay attention to the more negative, serious aspects of the relationship that they should also be paying attention to. So Brianna, that's a great question, and that's a great application of the halo effect as well. Definitely when we are just clinging to the one positive thing about that person that we liked, and therefore we're not willing to get out of this relationship because, well, they're such a great person. But that's just because we're choosing to only pay attention to the positive aspect about them that we initially liked, and obviously shutting ourselves off to other perceptions about them or observations about them that are negative. All right. So Geraldine has asked a question. Sydney has asked a question. Brianna has asked. I'm waiting on Daniela and Juan. I'll wait 1 more minute and then I will close it off. Yeah, I drink a lot of water during lectures. I'm sorry, but my voice gets very dry. So. All right. Since I don't see questions coming in from Daniela and Juan, I'm going to go ahead and close it out. Thank you so much for your questions, Brianna, Sydney, and Geraldine. I am actually in the process of grading your journals right now. If you haven't gotten an email notification from me, you will, for chapters 2 and 3.